Recording. Let me share my screen. Yeah, for some reason, Zoom on my computer decided it needed to update right before this meeting started. So I'm getting all these weird pop-ups. So welcome everyone. Advisory Committee meeting of Tuesday, January 20th. We have two items on the agenda for tonight, neither of which require votes. They are updates from activities of other committees that members of the Advisory Committee serve on, to bring us up to date on what's happening and to give us an opportunity to ask questions of the respective participants. So we're going to get an update on the activities of the ADU subcommittee of the Housing Advisory Board, which is from Kelly Hardebeck. And then we're going to get an update from Don Doggett and Cliff Brown on the activities of the Expenditure and Revenues Study Committee. If there's any members of the public who wanted to offer any comments about either of these items on the agenda, drop your name in the chat and we'll call on you before we get started. And I don't see anything, so I want to turn it over to Kelly to give an update on what's happening with ADUs.
Sure, and let me actually start to share my screen. I haven't done this since Zoom updated, so figure out how to do that.
I click on the little Zoom bubble in the menu bar in the top of my Macintosh screen.
I think I've got it.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Can you still see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Good evening, everyone. I'm excited to give you an update on where we are in terms of the ADU subcommittee of the Housing Advisory Board.
And do you want interruptions along the way with questions, or do you want?
Let's wait till the end, just because I do believe that really what I would love to be able to do is walk everybody through the timeline, excuse me, and also the process. So if you could, please hold questions, and I will say both Maria Morelli and I think I said Jonathan Simpson here as well. And so they are, they're here as basically my backup. And will hope to clarify any questions that committee members may have if I don't know the answer.
Okay, just wanted to check.
Sure, cool. So let's see. Oh, perfect. So I know not everybody may have been following the accessory dwelling units quite as closely as I have been. So I thought I'd walk everybody just through a little bit of the timeline here. So way back in August of 2024, Governor Healy signed the Affordable Homes Act, which allowed ADUs by right. And as a result of that act, in fall of 2024, town meeting, what came before town meeting was warrant Article 15, and town meeting approved a revised ADU bylaw. And at the time, we thought we were coming into compliance with the law. But at the time that town meeting voted to approve warrant Article 15, the EOHLC, the Executive Office for Housing and Livable Communities, had not yet finalized any regulations around ADUs. And so we did know that we were sort of in this in-between state where the law had passed, but the regulations had yet to be finalized. But we went ahead anyway and passed warrant Article 15, hoping it would bring us into compliance with law and the regulations. Unfortunately, the regulations were finalized in early 2025. And we were notified, the town was notified in June of last year that not all of the components, the provisions within our ADU bylaw were actually in compliance with the regulations. And so as a result, the Housing Advisory Board convened a subcommittee specifically to deal with ADUs and work with staff on identifying what could be some language for an ADU warrant article that would modify our bylaw in order to bring us into compliance with the law and regulations, and also really to examine what else municipalities could regulate with that. And the goal is to bring something to our annual town meeting in May. And so again, for those of you who are not following this as closely as those of us in the subcommittee, what is protected use ADU? And so this terminology again came into effect in 2024. And specifically what it is an attached, detached, or internal ADU that is within the confines of an existing structure, such as a converted basement or attic or other part of a building. And the key here is that it is located or proposed to be located on a lot within a single family residential zoning district. And that means a zoning district in which single family residential is allowed. So it doesn't limit it to, in this case, our S districts, but it allows it wherever that single family use is allowed. So first thing to note. Second thing is a protected use ADU is not larger in gross floor area than the lesser of 900 square feet or half the gross floor area of the principal dwelling. And again, this is an area where the municipality has an option to make a larger GFA should they like. And also the definition for protected use ADU stipulates that only one ADU in a lot qualifies as a protected use ADU. It's also noted that any ADU that is non-conforming to zoning shall still qualify one if it meets the definition otherwise. And so we have a pretty clear definition of what the state is looking for in terms of a protected use ADU. And unfortunately, Brookline's current ADU bylaw is not in complete compliance here. And so there were really three main issues if we were really to summarize them. And so we need to allow ADUs by right. There were several provisions and language within our bylaw that calls for special permit. And so we actually need to go through and remove those and readjust in order to allow ADUs by right according to the regs and to the law. Second is we need to allow for detached ADUs, which we previously had not. And the third issue is really around height and setback regulations. And I'll get into this a little bit more, but really the language that the state has used is this more permissive regulation in zoning districts. And so anything that regulates an ADU really has to use the most permissive regulations that we have in any of our zoning districts that allow single family homes. So I suspected that this committee might want a little bit more detail rather than the high level. So specifically, here's what was disallowed sort of at a high level. And I won't go through it all in excruciating detail unless you'd like me to, but really the first thing, the biggest thing is all the references we have to single family dwellings. So again, previously under warrant article 15, all of our references were to single family dwellings. That is, ADUs were allowed in our districts, specifically our S districts. And so the AG wanted to make it very clear that protected use ADUs are allowed by right on lots with the principal dwelling. And so that's our single family districts, duplexes, triple deckers, multifamily buildings, and also mixed use residential buildings. Basically any zoning district that allows that single family use. And so we do have some language to change. Second, our size. And again, most of you may not remember, but the size of the ADU that we had proposed was the lesser of 900 square feet or 50% of habitable space. And then we had a second special permit requirement. But according to 40A, the calculation is the lesser of 900 square feet or half of the gross floor area, which is a very different calculation from habitable area. Third, we did have a requirement that the principal dwelling or garage, because we allowed both ADUs in garages and principal dwellings, both of those structures needed to be in existence for 5 years before we could build in an ADU. And that is completely disallowed, as ADUs are a protected use under the Dover Amendment. We also talked about maximum height being 22 feet and 1.5 stories. And we'll talk a little bit more about height later. But again, that was disallowed, again, simply because our requirement was more restrictive than was allowed for other structures or other uses elsewhere in our zoning. Privacy screening, and again, we had a lot of conversations at our subcommittee meetings on warrant article 15 that really dealt with the screening of an ADU to provide that sort of coverage for abutters. And so that, however, is allowed under Dover as long as the town doesn't use it to prohibit or unreasonably restrict the creation of ADUs. We also had lots of discussions about the egress, so an external stairway. So an external stairway, we had said it could not be visible from a public way, and it must be less than 2 stories. So unfortunately, those requirements were disallowed. And again, we had extensive discussions at our HAB subcommittee about what would work. And we'll talk about some of those language changes in a little bit. We also, in warrant article 15, required common ownership for both the principal dwelling and an ADU. There was a lot of concerns that ADU could be condoed off to create really a separate dwelling unit with separate ownership. So common ownership was actually preserved. And so that is allowed, again, with the caveat that it cannot be used by the town to prohibit or restrict ADUs from being created. And finally, within our ADU bylaw, we had disallowed transparent, basically windows that open on the facade of an ADU. If it was facing, that side was facing a abutter's property, and that facade was close, basically within 10 feet of that property. So that provision was disallowed. And so as you can see, there were several different things that where the AG had struck down provisions within our bylaw. So as a group, we met 4 or 5 times really to go through this in a fair amount of detail, and working with town staff had tried to propose many different alternatives in terms of language to really work within, to try to work within the regulations and state law, but still allow Brookline some flexibility on ADUs. Oops, actually here. So basically, one of the first things that we'd really considered is, what do we do if our zoning is not consistent with the ADU law? And as I mentioned before, the regulations came out in early February of last year, and it's very clear that any provisions that are inconsistent are purely unenforceable. And so all of those regulations, which I had shown on the previous slide that were disallowed, completely unenforceable by the town. And so we need to really take a look at, as a subcommittee, we really took a look at what it would take to bring our current ADU bylaw into compliance, which would allow us to then enforce our zoning for ADUs. And I will say that one of the most challenging things we had to deal with was this idea of this more permissive regulation guideline. Because previously we had set very specific side and rear yard setbacks, as well as height for ADUs. Again, trying to really keep it, keep the ADUs within the character of what was within the zoning district. But the guidance that we've been given was we really have to consider what is the most permissive or the more permissive regulation that already exists within our zoning. And so it is dimensional standards for the principal dwelling, for a single family dwelling, or an accessory structure within the zoning district in which the ADU is going to be located. And so what it means is the most permissive regulation is the one that needs to be used for protected use ADU. And so again, this was tricky as we went through taking a look at regulations within the zoning districts for the principal structure and for accessory buildings in order to determine where and how we could regulate height and setbacks for those ADUs. I guess another way of putting it is the town really can't impose dimensional standards on a protected use ADU that are more restrictive than those that we would require for a principal dwelling or an accessory structure within that same zoning district. And so again, this was a big change from what we'd previously defined, because we'd previously specified side yard setbacks and rear yard setbacks by zoning district and had adjusted or had actually given permission really for a special permit if those were to be reduced. Unfortunately, that was disallowed. And so we needed to go through and take a look at what we had already within the zoning in order to be able to utilize that in coming up with proposals for modifications to the ADU bylaw. So after meeting and actually considering, as I said, several different proposals, including some from members of the public, including Dick Benka, and different language that town staff had proposed and different ways of determining height and setbacks, which were based on a bunch of different factors. Really what the ADU subcommittee really centered around was compliance. And so we've been out of compliance with the regulations. By the time town meeting comes around, it'll be for about 16 months. And so what we really wanted to be able to do was cleanly bring the town back into compliance so that our zoning would be enforceable for any proposed ADUs. So what we really decided to do was make it clear first in language that internal, attached, and detached ADUs are indeed allowed by right. We wanted to align our language, excuse me, for size around GFA, and we'd centered on 900 square feet, which is again what's allowed under the state laws and regulations. We aligned our parking requirements. I don't know if those of you remember, but parking requirements were that if you had an ADU and a converted garage, you basically needed to make up the parking, which again is not allowable. And so we loosened our parking requirement, again, to align with state regs, so that we require parking only if the ADU is located more than half a mile from transit. And then finally, for height and setbacks, we use the most permissive metric. And again, making it clear that this is within zones where that single family use is allowed. So indeed, the subcommittee felt it was really important to come back into alignment just so that our zoning would be enforced, rather than moving forward with several of the other proposals that we had reviewed. So I'm sure you have questions about height and setbacks. And so after having many discussions about height, what we settled on in terms of our draft language is that the maximum height allowed for protected use ADU will be limited to 22 feet. However, we did want to, we understood that a protected use ADU taller than 22 feet may actually, in some cases, it could change the character of the neighborhood. It could be outside of sort of outside of the height for that district, but we could not restrict it in any way or put it to a special permit. And so really what we centered around was if that protected use ADU is going to be more than 22 feet, the applicant really needs to submit evidence to the building commissioner that such a height is necessary in order to use that space as an ADU. So again, we were thinking of garages where you may need to raise it half a story, raise the roof half a story in order to make that garage conversion to a protected use ADU, as an example. And so such evidence, as you can see here, may include calculations for gross floor area, the height of the pitched roof, so it is compatible or more compatible with the principal structure, the dimensions of the dormers, or again, floor to floor heights. So again, wanted to make sure that we understood the rationale behind the need for the additional height, but can't really prevent that additional height itself. When it comes to setbacks, the minimum required front yard setbacks, the principal dwelling, or for a single family. And it should be noted, by the way, that we do not allow accessory structures in front yards under our current zoning bylaw. And the AG was actually fine with that restriction. Again, as long as it doesn't restrict the creation of a protected use ADU. Now, in terms of side yard setbacks, the minimum setback shall be 6 feet or the most permissive requirement. Again, zoning that we already have, and the required rear yard setback also shall be 6 feet. So I feel like, I guess, so those really in a quick, were a quick summary of the proposed language that the ADU subcommittee had come up with for revisions to the ADU bylaw. I will say, as we discussed, we do have a couple proposals that we're thinking about. So our first proposal was really designed, as I said, to come into alignment with state law and regulations. And also, we believe that it would just be a simple majority vote. Basically any additional proposals we do believe would require a 2/3 vote at town meeting. And so our discussion, we would love to be able to return to that 950 square foot limit that we previously had in our bylaw. And we would also consider eliminating a parking requirement. But again, the idea is that these would not be competing warrant articles. These would be warrant articles that would come either later in the warrant once we've reviewed the previous one, or perhaps at another town meeting in order to expand upon the work that the committee has already done. So I feel like I ran through this very quickly, but would be happy to take questions. And as I mentioned, both Maria and Jonathan are here, hopefully to back me up.
Well, I'd like to give Maria and Jonathan an opportunity if they wanted to add anything before we go on to questions from the committee.
I think Kelly did an excellent job. This is really dense material. I have just one tiny correction. We do, and I missed this, Kelly, but we do allow detached ADUs in the bylaw that was mostly disapproved. It is, but it's the side yard and rear yard setbacks are very difficult to meet. So it's yeah, it would be really hard to, let's put it this, it would be really hard to permit a detached ADU. And that's it.
Thanks for that. I'll correct the slides.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. So let's go to questions. Harry?
So I have the first question. I'll address it to Kelly. Kelly, as I understand it, in order to comply with state law, we have to allow ADUs in basically all single family zoning districts. if we were to change the law to allow it in single-family zoning districts, and I'm not advocating this, but there's been some talk about disallowing or forbidding those single-family zoning districts. So if later on,
I have something.
Somebody's got a mute.
Jonathan.
Sorry about that, guys.
so if later on we were to disallow single-family zoning districts, absent some other change in the law, would that disallow all ADUs?
I can answer that. Under
Thank you.
state law, you cannot ban the use. You could disallow single family zoning. You could change everything to a 2-family or a business or something like that, but you cannot bar people from building single family. You can't bar uses entirely. Like you can't say like you can't build anything in this. So theoretically, if you'd have to rezone the entire town to not allow residences anywhere, to ban ADUs townwide.
Can I also add to that, Harry? I just want to be sure that people are not getting confused when you see the state's term single family zoning districts. We think of single family zoning districts, as Kelly said, as the S districts, but the state defines single family zoning districts simply, or single family districts simply as any zoning district that allows single family use. So it could be your 2-family, your T district. So keep in mind, whatever zoning district allows single family use, and that's just about every district except office and industrial maybe, that's where you can allow an ADU, and that ADU can go in any principal structure that has at least one dwelling unit. So it could be in a 2-family structure in a 3-family district, for instance, or not that would happen, but it could, or it
Okay.
could, yeah.
Thank you,
Does that
Marina.
clear it? Okay.
Yeah, that clears it up because I didn't understand that our definition of an S was not the state's. Thank you again. Carlos Reduejo.
Thanks, Harry. I had 3 questions. The first one was, Kelly, can you just, I think I missed something somewhere, the relationship between the ADUs and the Dover Amendment?
Sure. Actually, I will defer to Jonathan on that.
Sure. The way the state chose to mandate the allowance of ADUs was by putting them in the Dover Amendment. It's part of Section 3 now, much like all the other uses that are similar to, but not identical to, all of the other uses that are in Section 3: educational, religious, agricultural, solar panels, daycares. So it enjoys an exemption from zoning, where the only real question is what isn't it exempt from? And in this case, it's not exempt from reasonable regulations. And then the state put out its state regulations, basically to telling communities what is and isn't reasonable.
Okay, so I guess because of our last town meeting or experience, seems like they're using the Dover Amendment to dump everything in that they need to dump in.
I think you're absolutely right. I think they're kind of like, this is their way of essentially signaling we're just taking this away from you, more or less.
Yeah. Second question was, I think Maria answered it, but so does that mean that you can have a ADU in a condo building?
You could. I think this is really gets into something that Jonathan could speak to. The condo association could write in their documents prohibiting that, and that would be okay.
But you can have it in a 2 and a 3-family without any issues.
You could, I guess you could have it in a condo, as long as there's just like, maximum of 1 per lot. But it's if the condo association wanted to write that into its docs, not allowing that, that would be okay. But if you had like a multifamily, let's say you had like a 3-unit structure and someone wanted to put an ADU in the basement, that is allowed.
Okay, so the ADU, which used to be a way of adding a smaller apartment or something into a larger house, now has been transformed into adding another unit, basically, to anything to any district where single families are allowed. So it could be from a single family to a multi-unit building.
Correct.
Okay, interesting. The last one was, so we said that we don't allow accessory buildings in the front yard. But then Kelly said that the state is okay with that as long as it doesn't restrict the use of the addition of an ADU. So does that mean that you can put an ADU in the front yard?
So one way we get around it, and I think we owe this to Jonathan, is really the way we worded it. We say that the ADU has to have the same minimum front yard setback as the principal structure. And that way we don't use language that says you shall not have ADUs in the front yard, because that's the only setback dimension. Accessory structures don't have a front yard setback dimension because they're not allowed in front yards. So, and then to maybe answer the second part of your question, what if someone said, hey, I don't have enough room. I have to put this in front of my principal structure. I can't put it to the side and have the same front yard setback as the principal structure. It is conceivable that they could exercise their rights under Dover. At this point, I don't know what would be deemed a reasonable regulation or not. I guess it's something that would be tested under Dover. Conceivably, it could end up at the ZBA. And then it would be up to the ZBA to decide.
Yes. And then I guess you also said that you no longer would have to comply with parking requirements. So you could transform sort of all the parking garages into ADUs if you wanted, without.
No, the ADUs just don't create any additional parking requirements.
Okay,
so you can't say.
I thought Kelly had said.
Space.
I thought Kelly had said at one point that if you if you turned a garage into an ADU, you no longer had to replace or make up for that lost space.
What Kelly, I believe Kelly was referring to is that it wouldn't, the parking would still be on site. It just wouldn't be in the garage. So it would be unsheltered.
Okay.
But if there was like a requirement for the principal structure to have parking, then they would have to have the parking. I'm thinking of maybe multifamily where there's a certain stipulation that you have to have a certain number of parking spaces, and that's how you got your permit. That doesn't go, you don't get to just modify, say, your special permit for a multifamily just because you're using the garage for something else.
Okay. My only comment would be that if the zoning bylaw was complicated, it's now impossible to understand. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Linda, you had a 2-finger on condos?
Yes, I did. Thank you, Harry. Just that zoning wise, I think we got the correct answer. However, to put another unit into a condominium would require an alteration of the master deed and a creation of a new master deed, which takes at least 75 and in most cases 100% of the ownership to agree to it. So I'm not going to rush out and hire a lawyer and put a prohibition to this in my condos bylaws because I don't think we need it, because there's other things preventing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Harry Bors.
Sure. So actually, Harry had brought up my question and my confusion about the definition of single-family zone district in the state legislation. It's not the answer I was hoping for, but it is the answer that I feared. But I have a separate question because I didn't process quickly enough the one slide about the rear setback, which I thought said 6 feet or the most permissive, which is less. Did I misread that?
No, for instance, the Harvard Street zoning has a 5-foot setback for accessory structures. So that's why we use that language.
I believe whichever is less, maybe there was just a typo or something.
Well, if it's whichever is less, so if you are in a single family district that says, say they're big lots with a 30-foot setback, you're saying that now, as of right, it could just be a 6-foot setback to the ADU?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Linda, did you have something else that you wanted to
Yeah,
contribute?
just one of the things that is a really big change here that hasn't been mentioned yet is in our Article 15, we had required owner occupancy of one of the two buildings, either the principal structure or the ADU, and the state law makes that unallowed. So now it can be, a developer can build an ADU. It doesn't have to be that either structure is owner occupied. It's a big
Thank you.
difference.
Thank you. Dennis?
I think this is a question that could be answered when we actually get into the warrant article review process, but I think one of the questions that will probably come up is the impact estimate of how many more properties are now eligible essentially as a result of the changes that are being proposed here. And I don't know if Kelly, if their committee has done any of that analysis yet, but I think I think town meeting is going to want to hear that.
There's a question that came up at our subcommittee meetings. I don't think we got a good count on that yet, though, but it definitely came up.
All right. Any other questions?
No one else on the list.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Maria and Jonathan. This is very enlightening. We can move on to John and Cliff, and I think Harry might be presenting while John talks.
So is John going to go first, or is Cliff going to go first?
Yes,
I
I'll be
don't
going
know.
first. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Dennis. And
Okay.
Dennis, Harry, if you could get the title slide up, would be great. Thank you very much.
Do you see it now?
Yes.
Or
Yes, we do.
Can you put it in full screen mode?
if I could figure out how, I could.
Go to where it says slideshow in the menu bar and pull down whatever the choices are there. A little farther
Okay.
down, just do it.
Slideshow.
No, above that. They should,
Ah.
yeah, I think. There you are.
um,
From beginning,
From
all the way to
beginning.
the left.
Okay.
Great. Thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. This is to update you on the Expenditure and Review Study Committee. Thank you for advancing the slide. It was organized back in March of 25, and just a little bit about the committee composition. Initially, there were 9 voting members and 3 alternates, so I'll talk about that in a second, which was subsequently changed to 7 voting members, where no select board or a school committee individual sitting on the committee as the primary member could vote. That was a change that the members agreed upon fairly recently, I think in November. The alternates are the school committee, the select board, and the advisory committee all have a primary representation, a voting representation, myself in this case, for the AC, and for Cliff is the alternate. The committee was asked to address 9 charges. I'll summarize. They're summarized on the next slide, so I'll just skip to the end of this one, and then we'll discuss what the committee was asked to do. And it's met 19 times in 2025 until December. In October, it was realized the committee was uncomfortable with the time frame and the amount of work to be done, and suggested, and this has been put into effect, that we split into 3 subcommittees: the town subcommittee, the school subcommittee, and the futures subcommittee, and come together periodically as needed. And this town subcommittee, which I'm on, is it met 11 times. Schools and have met 7 times, and futures subcommittee 8 times. And Cliff is on both of those committees. So when we get to that point, I'll ask Cliff to describe what's happening there in those 2 committees. Importantly, the deadlines. The final recommendations have been pushed back now to February 20th because we realize that we just can't get all the information together, particularly with the changeover in personnel in the school department, amongst other things. The goal is to recommend, if needed, an override ballot question by the final report recommendations, which contain hopefully all the if it contains an override recommendation, that the select board would have enough time from February the 20th to March 26th, which is the deadline for getting any question onto the ballot. So that's an important deadline, but we still think we can make this year if we need to have an override recommendation. Next slide, please, Harry. Harry?
I'm just having trouble moving because I can't see anything on my screen. Enter does not work, the arrow does not work, and tab does not work.
Try escape and see, and does that take it out of it?
No.
Let me see if I can bring up the doc that you sent. 1 second. I can try doing it.
Dennis, tell me when you want me to stop sharing.
Yeah, go ahead and I'll try, see if it'll work on my end.
Okay.
Hopefully people can
Great.
see that.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Harry and Dennis. Okay, so the charge summary, let me just run through them quite quickly. First one is to identify any budget gap between Brookline's projected revenues and expenses for FY27 and beyond, of course. That's sometimes referred to as the structural deficit. Although we never run a deficit, so projected revenues was the wording that's in use here. To assess the town and the schools' operating costs for potential efficiencies, explore additional revenue sources beyond an operating override, update benchmarks comparing the town and the school's finances to similar municipalities. Recommend whether to place an operating override on the May 2026 ballot, including an amount, fund allocation, and projects. Evaluate community impact of the revenue and spending changes, and analyze the consequences if the recommendations or override are not approved. I'm going to draw the last charge. I think I'll draw to particular attention for this committee because in this charge, the ERCSSC committee the report and recommendation is to advise the advisory committee, that's us, on measuring recommendations success. Just as a kind of personal editing note, I've never seen this requirement before, but there's always the first time, I guess, but certainly in your comments and questions, we might want to elaborate on that. Next slide, please, Harry. Sorry, Dennis. Okay, so this is where the full committee, I'm going to briefly look at what the work of the full committee and the subcommittee is. So here's the full committee. For your information, we have asked the town, and it's begun to assemble all of the documentation, all of the materials, the agendas, the records of the meetings, all of the associated documentation, the work documents, etc., everything that we have to be put in one place, publicly available. It's in the process of being engineered right now, and I know some of it is already up there, but there's more to come. So that will be a great resource, not only for ourselves in the committee, but also for anyone else that's interested in following along or looking at particular documentary details. The full committee had presentations from the significant or the major town departments. Smaller departments submitted written memos on the various questions that everybody was asked, relating to budgets, needs, possible efficiencies, etc., basically to gather the information from each department directly. Free cash and efficiencies, such as we have them to date, have been reviewed, and some stakeholder feedback has been received. Yes, I just there's an omission there. The planning department has been omitted from that list. It's been pointed out to me. I apologize for that. And some community input. Next slide, please, Harry or Dennis. The community input was the town administrator worked with the Harvard Business School and surveyed town residents using Flashvote to pose a 5-question survey on overrides. Unfortunately, time constraints limited the survey question review by the committee. The committee wasn't able to get to that and evaluate the methodology. It had to go to sort of press, if you will. Nonetheless, a significant amount of data is generated, and we elicited 738 responses to those questions and 357 comments. So already we've had some public reaction, certainly to the concept of override. It was a fairly simple questionnaire. And again, all of those details will be up in the file, the central file, when we get there. Next slide, please, Harry. Okay, so the work of the subcommittees. On the town subcommittee, the main focus has been providing report and recommendations framework for the full committee. So the report basis is there. And obviously the town subcommittee is focusing primarily on town departments and related financial activities. Identifying trade-offs for revenue and expense opportunities has been done, but not finished. Override and no override budget options have been presented by the budget department. And we're working through a draft report. And at some point, the school subcommittee and the future subcommittee pieces will be melded, rolled in, if you will, and ready, hopefully, for a final presentation at that date. Maybe Cliff, if you would, take us through what's going on in the school subcommittee and the future subcommittee, would appreciate it.
Sure. Thanks, John. So a little bit of context. The schools made a presentation back in December as to a 3-year budget forecast. It's a preliminary forecast. It's under review. It has been under review. A revised forecast is going to be presented shortly, maybe this week, maybe next week. Because there hasn't been a lot of financial information coming from the school department, The school subcommittee has not had really the opportunity, obviously, to sort of analyze anything and ask questions in terms of follow-up with respect to financial information. We have instead been trying to look at and evaluate different items that we think either could lead to efficiencies or maybe some marginal revenue. And that's what we're still focusing on. Hopefully that will change a little bit in the near future. So the topics that in particular we have been discussing include looking at BEEP and the fees charged in BEEP to see whether or not there is an opportunity to generate some additional revenue. Also, I have on several times indicated that back when BEEP went from a partial day up till noon and to a full day program, the statement was made that it would be break-even adjustment going from 12 to 2:30. We still don't have the data to enable us to verify that. We hope to be able to get that to understand whether or not that has actually occurred. Alternative education models, this is something that you'll see included both in schools and in futures. It's in both because obviously it is a school-related topic. It's in futures because anything that's going to happen there will not occur within the next 3 years. And the future subcommittee really is focusing on longer term post the next 3-year possibilities. But this would essentially evaluate ultimately whether or not Brookline should maintain the K-12 structure or to go to something that's either a full middle school model or a hybrid model. That is going to be a recommendation, I believe, of the school subcommittee they will make with, to the school committee. And we believe that there is some interest in actually evaluating that. After schools facilities usage is also, you'll see it both in schools and futures. It probably could overlap with town as well, even though it says specifically schools. This really is a question of, is Brookline utilizing the facilities it has to the maximum potential revenue benefit? And back in 2014, this was a topic that was discussed by that override study committee. The issues that exist today that have been identified either by our subcommittee or by folks who are actually involved actively with after-school activities remain the same as they were 12 years ago. We've circulated a draft. I expect that there's going to be a lot of support for it. It seems like there's a significant amount of revenue that could be generated. The recommendation that we may make will suggest a pilot program on a couple of different school buildings to see whether or not to prove the thesis that folks have. And another recommendation, at least in the draft report that's been circulated, is that this pilot program would be managed by Brookline Recreation, mainly because organizationally we believe that the town is better equipped to more professionally manage the facilities overall and not keep them separate, schools and town. It really should be under one umbrella to centralize information, coordinate between users, so on and so forth. Clearly the schools would have control of the buildings up until, let's say, 5:30, which is when the extended day programs essentially end, but these are town assets, and the idea would be the town would sort of manage things after that. We have looked at things such as sectioning and class sizes and the question about, empty classrooms. Are they really there? Aren't they there? What is the information that we've seen, and all sort of scratched our heads about what does it really mean? We have looked at the layouts for each individual building, identified or had identified where classrooms are, been told which classrooms at any of the buildings are quote unquote empty. There have been identified 6. They're all at Driscoll. The public schools of Brookline are not, using those classrooms to have smaller class sizes or anything like that. So we have had a reasonable review of the facilities. Finally, we are taking a look at the compensation structures. This is not something that this committee or any committee can really weigh in on, because this is a collectively bargained item, as are a number of things that we ask questions about. Yet, if there are things that we might be able to make suggestions about or comments on, we probably will take that opportunity. So what might our recommendations include? Enrollment forecasting, we've taken a look at that. We probably will have a recommendation about a best practice for the school department going forward, is to periodic outside reviews and forecasts, as opposed to just doing it internally. A recommendation with regard to financial disclosure and transparency, integration with the town systems and departments to the extent it makes sense to get efficiencies. The question about occupancy allowances in classrooms around town or in school buildings, and just a recommendation on what should be posted. And finally, a conversation related to the CLA report that was commissioned last spring, and whether it makes sense for the school committee or the town or the advisory committee to allocate funds to have an external review of the changes that have been adopted by the school department and the school committee. And the rationale behind that potential recommendation would be to provide, obviously, an independent perspective, which we believe might be add some comfort to the community, given the turnover and the issues that were identified last spring. I'm happy to answer questions about schools in a second. With regard to futures, the future subcommittee, as I said, we're looking at things post, I guess, fiscal 30. What are the topics we're looking at? Solar initiatives is something we're looking at. Out of district tuition paying students. Again, this is something that could be in the school subcommittee. This is something that we identified or raised as a question. The idea here, and it is something that the schools actually are evaluating, and I believe there is an expectation or a intention of trying to put this in place within the next 12 months, which would be to open up certain of our programs for special needs students to students who live in other towns, and have them be tuition paying to Brookline to come into these programs. Now, it's not a lot of money because it's filling in spots within the existing programs as opposed to expanding those programs, at least for now. What else are we looking at? Again, the alternative education model, it goes both in schools and here because of the time. Healthcare benefits, this is an issue that, is a collectively bargained issue, but it is one that we certainly are likely to comment on at some point. And I see John didn't actually include my last slide here. After building usage, we talked about economic development, broadly speaking, is something that we want to talk about for education purposes with the population, the voters, but also to encourage the continued robust focus on economic development. Finally, there is something that we have circulated, a draft memo regarding evaluating the OPEB policy post 2030. And 2030, fiscal 2030 is the year that we hopefully will be meeting our goal of fully funding our pension liability. And the current policy or plan is to take that money, which will be $40 million in 2030, roughly, and start allocating it 100% to OPEBs. And the question to be asked will be, is that approach a best practice? And if it is not a best practice, is there an alternative approach that we might take? So instead of allocating $40 million, maybe you allocate $20 million, because absent maybe adjusting that, there's every indication that a program or a series of overrides every few years is something that we're going to be locked into, absent substantial revenue from something like economic development, because virtually none of these suggestions are going to probably mitigate the need for additional revenue long term. As you remember, last week we heard that healthcare costs are going up by 12% or expected to go by up to 12% this coming fiscal year. That takes up the entire increase in revenue that's being forecasted for the town. And so we may need to get creative with some of these things. So that's the summary of the work of Schools and Futures. Happy to answer questions when we're finished here. John.
Thank you very much, Cliff. I've got one more slide and then we can get right to those questions. Work remaining, a lot of work, little time. What else is new? The PSB, what we're waiting for is PSB budget and committee question responses, which are not fully in hand or yet to be reviewed. The overall committee recommendations not yet formulated or discussed. Again, whilst that looks a bit bleak, there are obviously a lot of work has been done to prep all possibilities, a number of possibilities in all of these points. The structure regarding the override, which again, there's no decision has been made on a recommendation. The structure and the amount has not yet been formulated or discussed. And obviously to complete the report and recommendations. So it's going to be a busy month. So with that, I'd like to finish up this presentation portion and hand it back to Dennis to Harry. Cliff and I are happy to address entertain any comments or questions you have. Thank you.
Dennis, before we go to questions, I wanted to point out that one of the chair people of the subcommittees, Sergio Modigliani, is on the call.
Great. So thank you, John and Cliff. I'm sure there are a set of questions. So, it looks like Harry, you might have the first one, but everybody else drop your name in the chat if you have questions and comments.
So my question, just get this, is not original to me. At a previous meeting of the advisory committee, I think when we were discussing DPW and/or police overtime, a question was asked by Carlos Reduejo as to whether or not the payments we get from the Boston Athletic Association to cover the marathon actually equal the costs of what cleaning up and policing the marathon cost us? And the answer, if I remember correctly, was no. And Carlos, I will speak for him, suggested that not only should it cover the costs, but many cities and towns on these kind of events use it to extract more money from the organizations doing this. And so my question is, has this been raised as a revenue source at the override committee? And if not, perhaps you might look into it.
Yeah, let me just take that, and Cliff, please feel free to jump in. My recollection is that, of course, I also in that AC committee, so I'm not quite sure whether I've got meeting meld going on. But my recollection is it was mentioned, and I believe that we learned that the monies currently go to fund Brookline Day. My memory serves me right. And so that complicates the situation. But yes, it's certainly been documented, whether in terms of getting recommendations and getting through the report and recommendation mill up ahead. It's a good suggestion, and certainly it has been there. It's there. Whether it materializes or not, I think remains to be seen. Cliff, you got anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean that, you know, I would say that falls in the purview of the town subcommittee. I would say that you know, legally we should be able to ask for, whether or not we can get it, 100% of our costs covered, right? Recovery. I don't know about making profit beyond that, but it's absolutely something that should be evaluated. I'd be curious to know what the delta is that we're not recovering.
And I would suggest that if you look into this, you look at things like the thing on the Charles River in the fall. I'm blanking on what they call
Head of the Charles.
The head of the Charles and other things, and what other towns, such as Hopkinton and Wellesley and places like that, are getting from the BAA. I think this is sort of like the pilot program. This is money that we can't necessarily get, but we can certainly do the asking, and I hope that we do.
Harry,
Neil,
I'll just say,
Yep.
yes, the head of the Charles, I believe, pays about $250,000 to the state and the cities of Cambridge and Boston and security and other services, fire services, security services, etc. So they, the marathon doesn't do that for any of the towns. Thanks.
Danelle, do you want me to add you to the list? Okay. Neil Gordon.
Yeah, thank you, Harry. So I don't know whether there's anybody on the call that can necessarily answer my question, but I do think this ought to be a concern for the advisory committee. By way of background, some of you may remember I've served as treasurer and was at the table for 3, I think, override and debt exclusion yes campaigns. So I look at the timeline now from select board decision to the beginning of voting, which isn't election day anymore. When I was involved, it was election day. Now it's sooner than that, and it's a way shorter timeline. The school side of the budget, which is the big side of the budget, seems, and the work of the committee seems still in flux. And I'm wondering, in the context of the timeline and the slide that suggested when the select board would reach a decision on a ballot question, is how on earth is a yes campaign going to operate and promote a ballot question within the timeline? How is that going to work?
So my understanding is that an override vote would still be on election day.
It'll be on the ballot, and so you get to, as soon as the mail-in ballots are out, half of the votes have been cast in recent elections before Election Day. So they're cast absentee, by mail-in or early voting. It's a short timeline.
So, Neil, I could, I'm not in a position to answer the question probably the way you'd like to.
No, I
but
appreciate that. I know
but
that.
I will say, and I'm going to talk not as a representative of any subcommittee or for the entire committee. I will just pass on that the process this time has been extremely frustrating. And it's something that we've all had to, particularly the schools subcommittee, has had to and is wrestling with. But in the absence of data, there's not much we can do. And so then the question becomes, when the data actually is available, what are the options? You either make do with the time that you have, or you recommend, you didn't give us enough time, so we can only do or suggest a 1-year override. Or, forget it. Let's just continue this process and don't put an override on the table. There are ramifications to any of those options that we could talk about for a long time. I hate to say it is what it is. I don't know how to answer your question. It's a valid question, not just for anyone who's in favor of an override, but for those who won't be in favor of an override. And so the best that we can do, that I think that we're trying to assume we can do, is to write a report that is as informative and explanatory as we can. Cynically, I won't make my cynical comments publicly, but I think that's the best we can do.
Yeah, so
and the voters are going to have to deal with it.
To be clear, right, I don't lay any of this on the committee.
No.
Right, I don't think that this is a delay that is a result of the committee being late in its work. I know the complexity on the school side, and I appreciate the frustration, and I think we all share it. But from a pragmatic political point of view, right, how are the voters going to be informed? And take that as rhetorical.
It's a very fair question. I will say that the last one was not that different. It was not put on the ballot, was not voted on by the select board until sometime in the spring, back in, what was it, 2023, whatever the last one was.
And by historical standards, my sort of historical experience, it was a tighter vote than I've seen before.
Yeah, and look, we've had this discussion. I don't know what else to say to you, but I appreciate the comment. Yeah.
Thank you, Neil. Elise Couture-Stone, whatever questions you wish to have.
Okay. Well, first I wanted to say thanks to Neil Gordon for bringing that up, because that was a question I had for the town last week. And I wasn't really happy with their response with that either. And I feel like we're being forced in an impossible position. But to that end, Cliff, I have a question for you, which is, how confident are you and the committee with what you are seeing being reported from schools right now? How confident are you in the accuracy of those numbers being presented, especially in light of, our recent news? Apologies for the headache.
Yeah, it's a valid question. I appreciate it. I've been thinking a lot about it. I don't feel comfortable answering because I think I might just be answering for myself, and I think I need to be cautious about doing that. I do think that as a body, the advisory committee should be taking some time to think about what it might want to say and recommend or require select board consider with whatever it is they put on the ballot. You know, I think that type of conversation is something that this group should have. Otherwise, I think, Elise, it's really hard for me to express what I would characterize as a personal view on that question, because it is not something that has been discussed at our subcommittee or at the full committee. But it's, I think, a very valid question.
Yeah, I ask it because a lot of parents are now like, well, hold on. Why are we paying these high property taxes if we're having this kind of trouble in schools? So anyway, I appreciate your.
The one thing I will say is that it's sort of related to the likely suggestion of having some sort of independent review related to the changes that the school department put in place given the CLA report. So are we going to just accept what the school department says, or are we going to say the community is going to have a lot more comfort if CLA or some other party independent comes back and sort of, you know, verifies and approves and says, okay, best practices or what have you. I think related to that, again, for this committee is understanding what's done, what has been done, what the CLA report was relative to what this committee asked for last spring, and the question of whether or not the phase 2 that we anticipated was going to be put in place is going to be put in place. I think those are all sort of valid questions for this committee to be discussing.
Okay, so looking at stronger checks and balances systems then, and seeing how we can utilize those with schools, is that where you're leaning?
I would just, I guess I would recommend that we go back and take a look at what we had asked for, which for timing purposes and budgetary reasons was not put forth, and take a look at that document in the context of what has been done, and also whether or not there are any suggestions back then or conversations that indicated other steps were going to be taken. And Dennis and Harry, you may have some thoughts or remembrances about that better than I do.
Okay, thanks, Cliff.
Would just point out that in addition to Sergio, Sadaf Kazmi has joined the meeting, and she is also chairing one of the subcommittees. Elisa Jonas.
Hi. First of all, thank you, Cliff and John, for attending all those extra many meetings and probably having to do more work on top of just the meetings. So thank you. Let's see, well, there's a melding of questions, but other towns are having the struggles that we are having with the schools in particular, and Boston has its huge deficit. I just spoke with someone from Acton. They have a shortfall. They have decided they are not doing an override. They've instructed the schools to figure out how to cut. So I think John was the one who mentioned looking at other towns. And I'm wondering, it seems like for the schools, that might be an especially important thing to do. because all these school systems are struggling, and perhaps we could learn something about cost savings by looking at other systems. So I'm wondering to what extent we're doing that. And more specifically, not just for the schools, but generally, since personnel is the big driver, are we looking at specific subunits of different departments to determine or to wonder, at least, is this really necessary? For example, in the administration, in the schools, I know we've often talked about, is it personnel heavy compared to the need? Are we looking at that, and is that something that you can do without getting data from the schools about current finances? And the other thing I'm just wondering about is, oh no, and John, I'm wondering, have you found any efficiencies at the town level so far in your work that you haven't even thought of before and that look promising? And finally, I'm kind of curious to know about the outcome of the survey. I don't know if that's something that you can discuss. I'm not sure about the quality of that survey, but regardless, how did it fall on the views about an override? So those are my questions. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Elise. There's a lot there. Let me go back to your first question, if I may. The municipalities, yes, we have looked at other municipalities, not just for schools, but across the board. And the question there always is, are we an outlier, either high or low, or are we kind of, around the middle of that curve, in the middle of the pack? And it really is, I think, more of a point that is part of the ask issues, I think, relating to what Neil has raised about the campaign, the yes and no campaigns, is that are we basically not an outlier here? Are we spending, for example, cost per student educated in the town of Brookline? Are we kind of in the zone as opposed to being the lead sled, if you will, on that race? And maybe that, and so it relates to, I think, making the arguments at that point. So we need to understand that, and it raises a question: if we are an outlier, then why? Why is that the case? And so we have all the data, and processing the data is needs a little bit more work, but certainly, and in general, it's coming up with, we're not average, we may be above average, but we're not in the outlier situation in many of the hard measures that one can get from either asking other municipalities or going to the DESE, that's the Education Department's database. When it comes to schools, there's a lot of information there, which is very useful. So I think the answer is we are looking at that, but it's more of a positioning and are we out of line with that? Personnel, I think, was your second question. Is that right? That, of course, is the big issue, because 75% of the budget is personnel costs, I think, my recollection. And I think I know there the departments have all been asked for an FY27 budget to sort of keep the lights on, and also a budget which, if the any override didn't pass or wasn't put on the ballot, but more likely didn't pass, what then would happen? And we know, I believe the number is like 18 FTEs. I think there's a number that was the town administrator and the budget department have put together would be affected, and that they've identified where they would come from. And relating to your question, are we doing things that we shouldn't, or maybe, I'd say shouldn't, not quite the right word, but shouldn't be doing? And that's very hard. And it's very hard the way we cost allocators to determine what the cost of a particular service might be. So, I think in that regard, it really is up to the departments to identify positions, and then for us and them to relay what the impact of that decision is. So if we go for, a certain percentage decrease in budget for a particular department, and that's going to be impact, say, voters, or it's going to impact staff, it's going to impact the town, and it's to be able to describe those impacts. So again, that information is available. Coming back to, I think, Neil and Cliff's point, that information is available when you go to the ballot box to vote on whether you think that the town deserves additional revenue. And the last question, can you refresh my memory on that one?
Well, there were two. One is just my idle curiosity about the survey. I'm not sure how accurate it's going to be reflecting what's actually going to happen. But just whether you just have found any kinds of efficiencies at the town level that none of us had really thought about before, and that might have some significant impact and you're excited about. But the other thing is also with looking at the other towns, I certainly think it's important to look generally, but also just specifically to perhaps talk to the other towns to see what kinds of changes they're doing to try to accommodate their shortfalls.
We certainly have talked to other towns, at least the town administrator and his staff have. And but with that specific question in mind, I don't think that has been raised. It's more uncovering about how we compare with picking up trash, for example, or cost per student, or whatever the metric is, as opposed to have they come up with any good ideas. I guess that's a difficult question to address as to will the answer translate, be helpful to us? I don't know. All I know is that political capital gets used up very fast when you ask, and we did ask many communities to fill quite lengthy questionnaires on budgets. So I think that that's always unfortunately a consideration. Did I get all your points? I'm not quite sure. I'm sure I missed something somewhere there.
Well, again, it was the survey. What was there overwhelming negative or overwhelming positive on?
I can tell you that I do have.
Did you fill it out, Elisa?
I was going to, and then it was over before I got to it. But so.
Because if you filled it out, then you were sent a link to be able to look at all the written comments.
Okay. So I do have a slide here on it. I can't project it, unfortunately, but I'll just read it to you. It's question 2, which is probably what I think you asked. And the question 2 was, which of the following best describes how you think the town of Brookline should address this budget deficit? It had been established in question 1 about what a deficit was, etc. So if you remember, I think it was 300. I can't remember how many
responses. I think
yeah,
700. Like
700. Thank you. 700. Well, out of those 700 odd, 251, which is the highest number. 250. I'm going to go down in order of magnitude. 251 was keep the tax rate below the override level and cut the existing level of services. 246, slightly less, wanted to raise the current tax rates just enough to maintain the existing level of service. 155 said raise the current tax rates high enough to increase the level of services, and 70 were not sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brian Ladd.
You skipped me.
Well, Brian had raised his hand before he put it in the thing, so I excused him for that.
Go ahead, Brian.
All right, I appreciate Harry giving credit to my old person befuddlement here, and thanks very much to John and to Cliff for all of this. I want to go back to the very last item on the list for the future subcommittee, which was economic development, and my question is whether either the committee or the subcommittee discussed any concrete measures the town might undertake for future profitable economic development. And I ask that question against the backdrop of, as we all know, last week's budget presentation with the threat of deep cuts in the planning department, the rationale for which aroused some substantial consternation in this committee.
So I'll take that one.
Thank you, Cliff.
So yeah, the subcommittee has not yet actually discussed the topic in detail because a draft report, if you will, is still in the works. I, being the person who's primarily writing that, I can tell you that we may circulate a draft in the next couple of days, but it will not be complete. I will also say that the process has started with a document that was initially prepared by Chair Bernard Green from the Select Board. And I have taken that and incorporated comments from some folks on the staff and some folks, current and former EDAB members, and some of my own perspectives to have a document that, as I said before, I hope will be educational for those people in the community who don't know a lot about economic development, but also be reasonably assertive with respect to recommendations regarding the need for economic development. And it's hard for us as a group to basic subcommittee to essentially say, here's the level of resources you should have. I don't think any of us want to take that step, but I think it's pretty clear, it will be pretty clear that we'll be strongly in support of maintaining and enhancing, to the extent possible, the effort that the town has, because it's really the only major way a community can generate significant tax revenue beyond property taxes. So, I mean, new revenue, I should say. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Dennis, you are
Oh,
next.
thank you. So this presentation was great, and it answers a lot of questions, but it also raises some concerns as well. And Elise certainly touched on this a bit earlier, Cliff, on the school side, because as part of putting together a politically defensible argument in favor of an override, it requires a couple of things. So it requires as you've pointed out, a set of metrics that might be associated with understanding whether we're making a reasonable set of changes to our ongoing expenses and revenues to do the best job that we can to improve our overall financial picture before we go to the voters. But it also begs the question that we have a defensible budget that reflects a set of services that are meaningful. And the town administrator came to us a week or so ago and gave us an overview of the financial crisis that the town finds itself in, and offered a fairly compelling explanatory story for the deficit on the town side. And then a relatively large number was presented on the school side, and the presentation that John and Cliff presented said, well, one of the things we're waiting for is a school budget. And this is a long-winded way of getting to the question of, can we expect a school budget that represents a level services apples to apples comparison of what the schools actually need to provide a set of level services, rather than what we've typically gotten in the past, which is a budget that represents what the set of services the schools would like to perform in deliver in an idealized world. Now, I probably didn't say that as articulately as I could have, but I think you, Cliff, understand the question I'm asking, and I'm wondering whether you can comment on that.
Well, I will. I'll certainly comment on it. I will give you an answer, and I'm really happy that Sadaf is here. First of all, so that all of you can meet her, and obviously Sergio too. But if I say something that's not quite accurate, it's good to have someone else here who will provide some additional perspectives. So the schools came with an initial forecast, and that was presented back in December. And it was pretty sobering. And they are going to be coming back with something that's refined, that will be less sobering, but still having a good party at night, if you will. I mean, it's going to be a fairly significant deficit. And that budget is a budget that they would characterize as a maintenance of effort budget. Now, for the schools, there are a couple of things that I think are appropriate to point out. So the schools put in place, started a couple of years ago with a new curriculum for English language arts, right? And it is a curriculum that's based more on phonics, I believe, than what we had in place. They started with K-3. Okay? And the following year, I believe this year, they expanded that because it needs to go along with the kids as they age. And that is going to be continuing, and that's not an inexpensive process. These projections consider that financial requirement to continue to put that program in place as a maintenance of effort expense versus just keeping it with, say, K-3 and letting it wither after that. So that is a cost driver that they would consider to be maintenance of effort. It's hard to say no to that if you believe in the program that they're introducing. So we need to adjust for that. Otherwise, there will be some things that they will be looking to add back to address the cuts that they had to make last year. And part of that might be getting back the money that they had to take from the, help me out, which fund? The
World Circuit Breaker, yeah.
Breaker, not World Language. World Language, from as far as I know, is not on the table.
Okay.
Getting back to Circuit Breaker, because that is something that, like our, free cash, it's sort of like you're using it to do what they did with stealing from the future. I don't have the detail because we did not get a specific breakdown of everything that was in that budget as to what else they might be, quote unquote, adding back. That is still not a budget that includes any additional expansion requests. All right, so their maintenance of effort budget, from what we've heard so far, is a fairly sobering budget on its own. They are in a contract year. They've started negotiations. There was a negotiation meeting that was publicly posted, the conversation. I think it's going to be a very difficult negotiation. The schools, they have built-in increases from steps and lanes in inflationary increases that are major drivers. We see that every year when we take a look at how the budget increases from year to year. That's a significant part of their maintenance of effort budget. So I hope that, Dennis, addresses the question. It certainly is about the best I can do today. You know, we need the revised budget, and then we need the detail and the assumptions behind it in order to be able to ask the questions that we would like to ask as a subcommittee, and frankly, the advisory committee's school subcommittee would typically ask. We need that information.
Yeah, this is not a new set of questions, and I think the short version of your answer is yes. You've asked for a maintenance level budget, and they're providing something which approximates that, which seems like a good start from my perspective.
Yeah, we asked for it, and we had thought we were going to get it back in September.
Well, there is that.
Right, there's that. Sadaf, please, comment if there's anything that I have overlooked. And Elise, I saw your question. Elise asked the question of, do they have a deadline? I would say that the schools are going along their stated calendar for budget process. I don't think they're doing anything different than they would have done normally, which is frustrating for us. That means that, they're going to first present this next round to the school committee before they release it to anybody else. I believe they have to do it, within the next week or 10 days. It's just, I think by the 26th or so. They have to present something to advisory, I think by, it's mid-February, right? So they're, again, just sort of going along the same calendar as they have always used. And we certainly have been frustrated by that.
So Cliff, the only thing I would add to that, thank you. I think that was a good summary. The only thing that I think is worth calling out is in a broader expenditures and revenues study committee meeting, some point probably in August, September timeline. So several months ago now, Superintendent Wong did mention that to the extent that they are restoring positions that were cut as part of the fiscal 26 budget process that I think everybody saw in the spring of 25, that they would look to offset those costs with efficiencies as they undertake their analysis. So that was certainly the goal, and I think it's worth pointing out that that is the effort that I believe the school admin is trying to make. So I want to share that. Well, we haven't seen anything beyond the level services view to date, as you mentioned.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dennis, are you all set?
Yeah.
Danelle O'Neill.
Thank you, Harry. So I just have a comment and a question. First of all, thank you for digging in, Cliff and John, doing the work and doing the research for us. I had a two-finger and a comment in regards to the marathon money and cleanup from the DPW. So in regards to the cleanup, the marathon doesn't provide any money. The money the select board actually receives, it usually goes to Dr. Lloyd General's office in the human relations, and it goes towards racial equity. For example, the Juneteenth event is money comes from that bucket of money from the marathon as miscellaneous to the select board, and it goes directly to Lloyd. Lloyd requests it every year, but it goes to that department, just for clarity. In regards to the sidewalk cleanup and all that, I'm pretty sure that comes down to our overtime for the DPW. I know there's a situation last year. The trash didn't get picked up in regards to the marathon, but also that's a whole nother thing. So I had a question in regards to revenue and the override. So I've always been in opposition of overrides. Even when I ran for the select board years ago, I was in opposition of the overrides. I don't like overrides. In regards to the town side of the school partnership, right? In regards to what we can do as a town, and I was curious if, and I mentioned this, I sent an email to Chaz and a few others in regards to what the city of Boston is doing in regards to social consumption. Another revenue source in regards to cannabis that is helping the city of Boston. I haven't received any emails back from our legal department in regards to the new state laws. But I was curious if that was mentioned in regards to a new revenue source, the social consumption, like the city of Boston is doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Donnell. I'm not. The question is. Let me just rephrase that. Your question, Donnell, is concerning whether there's a possibility of getting benefit from social consumption in any way. Is that right?
That's correct. Has that been mentioned at all? I mean, the city of Boston is doing it. So why? Yeah.
It's not been
What is
mentioned.
social consumption? What is social?
It's like a hookah lounge for cannabis. If that's helpful.
I believe one of the challenges, the HCA agreements are winding down, or if not wound down at this point.
No, regardless of the HCA, I mean, there's still revenue coming in from the cannabis, regardless about the host community agreements. There's still revenue coming in that we receive. So I was curious about that.
Well, the committee, to my knowledge, has not discussed it. I've not seen any documentation on it, but certainly we'll bring it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Janice Kahn.
Thank you very much. And I concur with my colleagues who have expressed appreciation for the work that Cliff and John and the others on this, who have been on this committee, have done. Yeoman's work, honestly. So I've been thinking about the structural deficit, and the problem is that we have certain structures in place that maybe need to be reevaluated. And I'll just talk about schools for just a minute, even though we've talked about it. But before ed reform in 1993, and after Prop 2.5 was passed in the 1980s, those of us who had kids in the school system experienced a change in the way the educational program was delivered here. And they invested in the core programs, and they cut a lot of the peripheral programs. And they raised class sizes. Our kids went through the schools with large classes. And it just seemed like they were better partners back in the day when they had a little bit less autonomy and maybe a little bit more accountability within the town itself. And I really hope that the schools can become better partners again. So that's my comment, though. But I was thinking about the structure. So there are two, from my point of view, two basic structural problems. One is that the cost split that we have for healthcare, which is very, very generous. I mean, there's no question it's generous. I don't know of any other town that does 83/17 as a split. And I've been thinking that, the federal government changed the benefits that newer employees at some point, old employees were under one system, newer employees were under another with fewer benefits. I mean, that's what happened. And even within Brookline, we changed the educational incentive in the police department. So those under the old system got to stay with the old system. And then, and both of these were union contracted. So I know I've raised this before, and they said, well, it's the unions. But honestly, I think that for the Futures Committee, that it's something to really, really look at. Because, what we might have been able to do as a sort of a carrot to get people onto the GIC back in the day clearly is problematic. Sergio wrote in the comments that 85% of the PSB budget is personnel. And I would say that on the town side, it's probably pretty similar. So, yes, so we have to also look at the way we do business in Brookline also, I think, is another efficiency or structure that we should look at. You know, every department doesn't need a community engagement person. I mean, from the Elisa asked about the response rate. So it's 1% of the population responded to this, not a representative sample. It was self-selected. And the fact is that, you know, we send out more and more of these surveys and we're getting fewer and fewer responses. So I'm not sure it's really helping the town to have every department send out surveys to ask people what they want. That we need another way to engage people, I feel. So I think that definitely we need to think about the way we both structure how we do business in the town. And you know, I think it is unfair, frankly, to just think that we can pay for what we have now, you know, a maintenance of budget by having overrides passed every year or every 2 years or every 3 years. That we should really look at the way we actually deliver services and do things. I know that there are some attempts, some successful, some not so successful in this town. But the fact is that we were not passing overrides so frequently back in the day, and we were providing quality services. So I don't know what, you know, what the committee's been looking at in terms of future structural changes that can be made.
Let me address your question about benefits. All right.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that this is an issue that was discussed back in 2014, the overrides. And it's not as if everyone hasn't talked about this or everyone wouldn't like to address it. It really comes back to the process by which we entered the GIC and the lack of flexibility we have because of that. So Brookline was one of, I think, it might have been just 6, David might know, 6 or 8 different municipalities that first entered the GIC. And a couple of years later, they changed the rules in terms of if you were in the GIC, what you could do with your participants. And people who came in after that initial period were able to put in place a regime that did exactly what you're talking about. So new employees, they could be dealt with differently than people who, you know, were in prior to them. And a number of communities have that. There was no grandfathering. And so we are one of those small numbers of communities that do not have the ability to take advantage of that, for lack of a better term, discriminatory allowance. In order to get there, we need the approval of the unions, and you need at least 51%, and that requires the schools, the school union. We can't get there without their approval. So we're in a difficult situation because of that. Otherwise, I think everyone agrees with you. Everyone. I don't know. Well, everyone is. There's no question that we would love to be able to adjust that. We do pay more than any other community that I'm familiar with. I think Lexington comes close to us, but others are down in the 75% area. And that is a lot of money. Believe me, it's a lot of money. It's a collectively bargained issue. if we were to get there, it's really a question of what we'd have to give up instead.
So if the schools are now engaging in contract negotiations, isn't this something that they could present or?
As I said, of course they can. I don't know if they are, and I really don't want to know. I mean, I don't think that they are unaware of the issue either. As I said, there's no free lunch with something like this.
I appreciate your comment, Cliff. Thanks very much.
Sorry, Susan Granoff.
Oh, thank you. I too am very grateful for the excellent presentation we had tonight and all of the hard work that I'm sure has gone into the many meetings that everyone on this committee has been participating in. One of my questions relates to how the override questions on the ballot will be presented. Has the committee given any thought to having a separate override for the school department, separate from that of the town? And I'm sure there are pros and cons to this, but I'm just wondering if this is going to be under consideration at all, particularly in light of the delays in getting the information you need. If they were separate questions, you could actually be working on the town side approval at an earlier point in time, because you wouldn't need to be waiting for this information to be coming from the school department. And the other thought I had is that if it were separated out, perhaps the school department ballot question could have tiers in terms of what they would like to have, what they absolutely need to have, that sort of thing, and leave it up to the voters on that issue. So again, one question I have is, what sort of considerations are you discussing for the actual ballot question presentation to voters?
I'll take that if I may. Thank you very much, Susan. We haven't got to that point yet. I think I had it on the slide there of work to be done is the structure of override, if there is to be an override. Whether it's a menu, you have a tiered override, they call it, or menu, and where that might be an appropriate option, but it's premature at this point because no discussion has taken place. But it is definitely on the cards to have to, in terms of the recommendation going forward. If there is to be an override recommendation, then it also will be structured, and the amounts and so on and so forth will be along with that recommendation. And the question will arise if we don't have the data to make that decision. I don't know what happens, to be quite honest, but I'm sure that we'll work something out.
Okay. Yes, no, I think that, I guess I was working backwards in terms of how this will be presented to voters. One remark that one of you made was that maybe it was Elise talking about how potential voters are concerned about, and of course the advisory committee has expressed concern about the need for outside review of the school department's procedures, financial procedures. And I'm wondering if that could be part of the language, if there were going to be either a separate wording for the school department override or a separate question on that, where that would be part of what the override would be paying for, so that voters would understand that that is going to be part of any override voted for the schools, that this is something that that there will be additional supervision. Because I think that if voters are reading Brookline News or any other publications, I think there's a certain level of concern about the lack of oversight. And this would be one way of reassuring voters that they're not simply giving a blank check to the schools, but that there would be additional, as part of the override, there would be additional steps taken to make certain that the money is being spent in ways that are prudent and acceptable administrative functions are being handled in a careful way. So, I mean, I think that part of what you're doing, in addition to making excellent recommendations, is to try to develop something that is going to be something that voters will feel comfortable voting for. And I think that part of it is in the amount that is going before the voters, but part of it is in how it's worded and in what people are going to be told that the override is specifically covering. And I think we need to be cognizant of making it clear that we're asking for really important, essential things. The second question I had about the Futures Committee, how much are you taking account of changes in the size of Brookline's population and in the demographic breakdown of these changes? Because in terms of the services that will be needed and future decisions, I think that those are probably factors that should be taken into account. But I'm not certain if you've had time to investigate the data related to that.
So let me comment on these. So I want to talk first about your comments about the structure of questions, and also specifically about including part of an override for funds to, it seemed to me like it was like an ongoing presence. Remember that an override is a permanent increase in taxes, right? So if there's a desire to have a review of what the schools have done in the last 6 or 9 months, to raise money permanently that's going to continue on, it seems to be excessive, as opposed to finding the money to do that review and seeing whether or not you're happy with what's been put in place. And if you're not, then you're going to have a conversation between the town administrator and the select board and the schools. In terms of the wording, there are specific, and I'm not an expert on this at all, but there are specific ways that state law allows for questions like this to be put on the ballot. And there are specific ways that they allow the language to be presented. I'm not in a position to really opine on those. Jonathan Simpson, who's here, might be able to. But I do think that the structuring is something that I'm not sure how much the committee will be leaning into. It's possible we'll make some suggestions, but at the end of the day, it's obviously the select board's decision. I'd be surprised if they would put on the ballot a separate question for the town and a separate question for the schools. It's certainly at different times. I'd be really surprised at that. As it relates to your second question, Sergio's here, so he can say differently if he disagrees with the comment I'm going to make, is that we are not looking at the changing or future demographic composition of the town as it relates to making recommendations about what services the town should have in place. That's not really what the group is focused on. I think that sort of a policy decision really comes from the select board and the town administrator, as opposed to a temporary override study committee. I think we're looking at more broadly efficiencies and opportunities than making sort of specific policy recommendations regarding specific services. That would be my own personal view. Sergio or Sadaf, you can say differently if you feel so.
Well, let me just add a thought. If you're talking about demographic changes, the presumption that we already know about is that Brookline is becoming increasingly a wealthy community. We know this from housing data. And I suppose we could say that brings in a certain cohort at one end. And at the other end, we have an aging cohort, which is on its way out. But to Cliff's point, these specifics have not been things that we've chosen to focus on. And moreover, in terms of growth in population, there's no indication of any significant change that I'm aware of over a substantial time period. Population has been remarkably stable. And yes, there will be some modest growth from changes in zoning, but it's pretty modest.
Okay, so the fact that the population, as you said, the aging population is getting larger. It's now over 20% and it's growing towards 25%. Does that make a difference in terms of services that might be needed?
Again, go ahead, Sergio, please.
I mean, I think that there are members of our full committee who have been very conscious about the issue of services, particularly to the elderly, social services in general. And in that sense, that has been a focus of some discussion, but it has not been a focus of the futures per se.
Okay, that's good to know. So in terms then of the, have you had any public hearings? Or do you intend to have any public hearings about your recommendations?
Susan and John, there have been no public hearings, but there is planned to be one. There is definitely on the original charge, absolutely.
Do you know approximately when that might be?
No.
Okay. Will it be before you present your recommendation to the select board?
Well, I think it's more likely that, first of all, we have not made any recommendations. We haven't even made recommendations out of the subcommittees have not voted recommendations to even bring to the full committee yet. I don't know if there will be time for the committee as a whole to have a public hearing, as opposed to just having it be with the select board. That's sort of, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if we're going to have time to do it, but public hearings are certainly going to be held. They have to be held.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just trying to, in terms of the time frame that you presented to us, it sounds like everything has been somewhat unexpectedly delayed, and yet there's a fixed date when you have to have your recommendations to the select board. So I'm just wondering how much opportunity the public still has to have input.
Well, the most important input you have is going to be with the select board and not with this committee. This committee is just sort of like an advisory committee. I do want to, emphasize that our role is not to make judgments about what programs are more important than others. I don't think that that's in our charge.
So the select board will be making the decisions as to what the override monies will be used for?
Well, the select board, the town and the schools are going to come to the committee or the committee with requests, right?
Okay.
And so that's what we're going to be, I think at the end of the day, what we're going to be focused on determining is whether or not the town can, the population can afford everything that they want to do. And to the extent that we end up suggesting less, I don't know that we're going to be, and people can disagree with me, my colleagues can certainly disagree with me. I don't know that we're going to weigh in and say, this is what you should cut, as opposed to saying, here's how much money we think that you should ask for, and you can decide how you want to give it.
Mm-hmm. So that's the form that your recommendations will be taken? I wasn't quite certain, based on what we heard last week, how detailed your committee's recommendations will be.
So what I can say is that I'm not aware of any a recommendation formulation that's going to say, we want you to give $3 million to X. I'm not aware of that being a recommendation or a likely recommendation. It certainly wasn't a recommendation in the prior override study committees I've been involved with. What there was a request made and a determination by a group that you didn't need this money. And so the recommendation would be to provide less, because we didn't think you needed this many people, if you will. That's different than saying we think you should cut a service and put that money over to a different service.
Right. Now, I was just reacting to what Melissa Goff presented to us last week. There's a page that's called Potential Contours of Override, and there's a breakdown of various potential allocations. And I'm not certain where that came, who developed that potential list, but I assume that that would be what you would be discussing, even if that wasn't going to be your final recommendation.
The committee did not evaluate, participate, or review any of that data prior to that presentation last week.
Oh, I see. Will you be doing anything like that, or are you likely just to pass that to the select board?
Ultimately, the select board and the school committee are going to come with a request, and the committee is, going to evaluate, again, this is my view, how much we think the community can afford. And if there is a request that presents itself in a way that we can argue on weeds, we might do that, but I'm not sure that there will be that sort of detail. We certainly aren't going to be able to do that with the schools beyond saying, for example, okay, you think you need, one nurse per 10 kids, as opposed to national recommendations, which is one nurse for every 200 kids. And we'd say, we're not going to recommend you get a nurse for every 10 kids.
But what about on the town side?
I'm thankfully not on the town subcommittee, so I'm not going to.
I am. I've always understood this committee as being essentially advisory, doing the sort of heavy lifting of the examination of the facts and what is considered reasonable and can be justified with a narrative that makes sense, and that it goes to the select board, who have the ability to ignore all those recommendations because we are advisory, literally a double advisory, I guess, and they can choose to put on or not put on anything that they wish. They are the sole arbiters of putting the question on the ballot. So really, in terms of one possibility is that everything goes to November, perhaps. I mean, there's there are all kinds of scenarios that are probably undesirable, but nonetheless will maybe thrown around when that point in the discussion, which is going to be relatively soon, takes place. But I think we're kind of speculating here. But I think that the answer is the select board decide what the number is, and they obviously want to keep everybody happy. I no doubt they will consult with the school committee and school departments and all the other departments and come up and hopefully we have a report that they can say, well, here it is. Here's the reason why we're going with X, or why we're going with X plus or X minus, whatever they think is whatever is going to pass. There is a political calculation here that they have to weigh, and that is if the ballot fails, what happens? Well, we know that there's going to be severe cuts, but what does that mean for the future? And all those planning. I mean, it would be quite a serious outcome. So I think they want to get the number right. They don't want to go in too low. They don't want to go in too high. But can they justify whatever they're going for? And they're looking, I think, to this committee, the ERC committee, ERC committee, to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Fran Perler.
Hello. So let me start out by saying I find this whole process as frustrating as I'm sure the committee does. It seems irrational to have to make decisions on overrides without the facts being provided to you, and that the delay in obtaining budgets and specifics is really very difficult to accept. Although I understand we have very little that you guys can do about it. In lieu of the fact that you don't have the numbers from the school committee, can you look at certain things? Like I remember last year discussing the fact that the school committee thought it was great to have 15 students in a classroom, which is less than many private schools. So can the committee look to evaluate other metrics? Did you get that?
No.
No.
You froze. So
what I was saying was that can the committee look at some of these metrics of performance and what the committee is suggesting, like, for example, 15 students per classroom, or do you, while you're waiting for your financials?
So, I mean, the answer is yeah, we can, and we have looked at several things. So, we took a look at when they came up with their population forecast for next year, and they described the methodology. I, went back and I tried to replicate it and to see whether or not it was reasonable given history. And is it reasonable? I think it's reasonable for a single year. I don't know that it's reasonable if you're going to be trying to project out, 3 or 5 or 7 years. Okay, and that's just the specific way that it was designed. And so we are going to make a recommendation, as I said before, that they retain an outside party to do forecasting, every 3 years or so that they can have a more scientific look at population projections and enrollment, developing enrollment forecasts. Do I think they're going to do that? Yeah, I think they might. I think there's a good chance that they will. In terms of things like class sizes, as I said before, we were all sort of flummoxed by the enrollment chart that came out last March that seemed to show a lot of empty seats and unused sections and all that type of stuff. And so we went and we took a look at the floor plans for each building. Every principal of each elementary school filled out where classes were. So where every kindergarten class was, every first grade, where the science rooms were, so that we were able to take a look and to see how they actually were utilizing that space. I can tell you that it's very interesting, because there's a lot of space in the schools that are not quote unquote classrooms, like K to 5, everyone, or K to 4, everyone's in the same class all day long. You start getting up the upper grades, they're moving around a little bit. But what I certainly didn't appreciate is how much space is in the public schools that is used for things like special education and for English language learners, and how those are separate from the individual classrooms. So do I think that they're fairly accurate with their usage information that they've been providing us? I do. The way that they allocate rooms and kids is not as simple as we might want it to be. So it's not that they will put in 25 kids, and if there's people in this particular district, that they're able to pick them up and put them over into another school to fill up that class. And so if the guidelines are 20 to 22 for K through 2, and you've got 3 classes of 21, or 3 classes of 2 classes of 21 and a class of 22, when you get another kid or another 2 kids that come in, they end up splitting those classes and they have smaller class sizes. I don't know what you do with that when when so many kids come in at odd times of the year. A lot of kids come in from overseas right in August. A lot come in January, so they have buffer space. We have an enormous amount of churn in Brookline. It's 40% churn in Brookline. That makes it very hard to predict stability in terms of population in individual schools. So I don't think the school department is consciously looking for 15 kids a classroom. I think, frankly, at that level, it becomes sort of counterproductive. Yeah, Sergio, I think it's more than that, but we're not going to argue that here. Okay, yes, I'm reading the memos. So one of the other things I mentioned earlier was a recommendation about posting occupancy levels for classrooms, and this recommendation is coming as the result of a letter that was written last spring as it related to, I think it was 4th grade class sizes at Driscoll. Because the class sizes were like 23 or 24, right? And one of the parents wrote to the architect of the Driscoll School and asked what the buildings were designed for. And the information they got back was that they're designed for 22 kids and 2 adults. And so with 23 or 24 kids in the classrooms, they were saying, you know, you're violating the occupancy rules. So we had conversations with the building department, and, you know, we had that information from the architect, but building code would say, after adjusting for appropriate square footage for egress, that you could have as many as 39 people in that classroom, but it's posted as 24. And so the recommendation is, okay, schools, building department, who's ever making the decision as to what the posting of occupancy limits are, go with what you know, the law says you're allowed. Building code says building code allows you to put in. And then the school committee can institute whatever policies it has for class sizes. And for 4th grade, it's like, what was it, 23 to 20, 22 to 25. And that eliminates the issue. But that wasn't happening. So you get a lot of this dissonance in the community. And so these are small things. They really are small things, but they create hassles. And when you have those challenges, it takes up resources, it takes up time, it takes up, it creates confusion, and frankly, I think creates distrust, because people don't have common understanding of what the rules are. That's not, you know, it's not going to save a lot of money at all. It's not going to save any money, but other than potentially staff time, other than making sure that everyone understands the way the schools are trying to operate. So
just a comment then. I believe that distrust is the major word that people are now thinking regarding our schools, given the churn of administrators, given the lack of transparency, given the fact that they don't seem to want to cooperate with providing the town with information necessary to establish budgets, given the fact that, you know, they seem to have expectations for how they teach that are different than others. I think it's really tough. And one has to realize that the constituents and the people I talk to, 50% of our town doesn't have a kid in school. And we need to balance when the town is tightening its belt, the school needs to realize, and I thought they started to, that they need to tighten their belts. They need to learn how to be more efficient. And in fact, in the last couple of years, we haven't been doing that well in testing. And half the parents I know on my block send their kids to private school.
Fran, I mean, you know, I appreciate the comment. I think you're preaching to the choir, certainly in this group. You know,
but how can we get the school committee to hear us?
So the way you can get the school committee to hear you is to elect school committee members that you think will hear you. Honestly.
And on that note, we will go to our last questioner with Michael Berger.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Cliff and John, for your work on this. So Cliff, you mentioned preaching to the choir. So one would wonder, well, we spend so much time and no one hears what we sing. So that's a problem. I had a question or comment, actually. We heard the term way in about an hour ago about economic development, how important it is to the town. Well, it really is commercial development that's important. And there's a difference between economic and commercial. And here at Brookline West, I mean, we're looking for commercial development, and we're only getting projects that really have a lot of embedded housing as well. And so that is not going to help basically residential taxes. We heard from Melissa last week that the assessor is being, she didn't use the words more aggressive, but more diligent, getting more taxes for the full value of homes. We all saw our tax bills increase. My concern, and I've said this before, I said it last week, I don't think that the residential community as I know it and knew it for the last 49 years is sustainable in Brookline. It really is not. And that is a real concern to me. And so I guess one of the questions would be, in terms of commercial development or increasing the burden to more commercial properties as opposed to residential, what kind of actions are being taken? What incentives are being given to developers to make that happen? No one wants that. Okay.
No, I mean, I'm hesitating to answer because this is going to be a conversation that is not going to be a conversation that has been held at this at the Futures Subcommittee or the entire committee. It's more, I can talk about this from the perspective of someone who's had a career in real estate and real estate finance, and who was a member of EDAB for a very long time. But you may not really totally like the answer. So it's a question of whether or not you want to have that conversation here, you want to have it offline, which I'm happy to do. I mean, I don't know how to respond. Maybe you can give an executive summary of. Sure. Okay. So I would disagree that economic development means only commercial development, commercial construction. And I would disagree with the notion that additional residential is only going to raise residential taxes because there's a presumption that you build more residential and it just generates more school kids and it's too expensive to educate them. I just don't think that that's an accurate assessment. I also think that commercial development is, the type of commercial development that this community is able to support. And what I mean by that is, where have we been successful? We've been successful with some hotels, okay, but hotels are, you get market saturation very quickly with hotels. And hotels have long lead cycles. And it's not until a population gets big enough that it is able to support additional hotels. And they're inherently risky and very, very expensive, all right, because they're so inherently risky. So right now, do I think there's an opportunity for another hotel in the next, couple of years? I don't. Do I think that, over the next 5 to 7 years, there might be? Sure. Do I think there's room for another 3 or 4 hotels? No, I don't. Brookline is not a location that is going to be supportive or have the demand for major office buildings. There's just no reason for people to locate a major office building here. And major office buildings are quite expensive to construct. So what does that leave in terms of commercial? It leaves, medical office, ground floor retail, and some additional, retail. And medical office, given the state of what's going on around here, are we going to have demand for additional medical office in the near future? Maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know. So if you're focused on things like ground floor retail, then it becomes an issue of, okay, what, how do you make that happen? And whether or not it's sufficient in terms of just building more ground floor retail to actually create the sort of economic impact that you're talking about. And by the way, if you're going to have ground floor retail, you need to have an infrastructure and an environment that supports that retail so that the businesses actually want to be here and they're going to be able to thrive. Brookline has a commercial difference in residential tax rates and commercial tax rates already. I think we're allowed to go up 100 to 175% differential. I think we're pretty close to that right now. And commercial properties have had a tough several years, so their relative valuation has gone down. And on a relative basis, residential has gone up in terms of value. And that's why part of the reason our residential taxes are more. Back in 2014 at the override, it was very interesting. Condominiums bore the brunt of that override because condominiums were increasing in value at a more rapid rate than single family homes. It fluctuates, and because we're capped by 2.5, those fluctuations in value have a real impact year after year. Ground floor commercial, single, one-story commercial, if you've got a property that is currently fully rented, fully leased, and generating income, you're not going to tear it down. Okay. And if someone is going to have to buy an existing ground floor retail, let me tell you what the impediments to a transaction actually happening are. Most of the retail in Brookline has been owned by families for a very long time. And when you own real estate for a very long time, you have what's called negative basis. Okay? Because when you borrow, let's say you borrow, building's $100. You put down 10 in equity and you borrow 90. You depreciate the entire 100. Everything that goes past the $10 that you invested becomes negative basis. And so when you sell a property, and you get tax deduction because of that, when you sell a property, the tax IRS recaptures that negative basis and taxes you at a regular income tax rate, not a capital gains tax rate. So it becomes extremely expensive for a long-standing property owner to be able to sell a building. And no one's going to pay enough for someone who owns single story retail to rebuild just the same sort of space and make it worth the while the person who currently owns it. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, that the Harvard Street corridor is going to take such a long time to get developed. Because in order for people to actually put together parcels, they're going to need to buy that existing one-story or two-story, sets of properties. No one's going to sell because of the tax implications. The only way those projects really begin to make sense is as a mixed-use development that has residential. And it's just the reality of real estate economics.
Maybe it's the point that we are here in South Brookline. Newton has found a way to produce a lot of retail, and in fact, every time I go up to Star Market, which is in Newton, I park in the parking lot there, which is in Brookline. We really have not done a good job, and that's potential area. If you were to put a hotel there, you have tremendous retail right associated with it. It is not the same as Harvard Street. It's a totally different property. But your retail, you're in development. You know about that. I'm not in development.
I'm not in development.
No, but you're in real estate. So I thank you for that. I just would point out that maybe it's a little bit different here in South Brookline, that the dynamics are different. It just appears that to me, going up to Route 9 every day, and we are having some development, but it's very difficult to get any retail, and there's so much commercial retail in the town. So I just have a question. And when you do the comparison of different communities, be sure to take into account the different amounts of commercial and residential percentage properties in those communities, because we're not the same as Arlington or the same as Newton for sure. We are very unique.
Okay, hey, so if you were to look at, and I haven't looked at it in maybe 5 or 6 years, okay, so it could be different now. But 5 or 6 years ago, I can tell you that Brookline had more taxes from commercial real estate than Newton did. Okay, and so you should look at those numbers and see what they are now. And to look at Star Market today is not the right thing to do. Because, and by the way, Star Market located where it did because the developers of Star Market did not want to deal with Brookline. And that's why they put their parking lot where it is. Okay? And Newton, the land values in Newton are less expensive than they are in Brookline. You know, you go around along Washington Street in Newton, all that development there, which happens to be residential with ground floor retail, you know, less expensive to purchase that property. The street was developed based on existing real estate, okay? Someone bought that existing real estate and they were to fill in around it. They had that infrastructure and they have a ton of parking as well. There are a lot of things that go into making a successful project. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Dennis.
Yes. Well, thank you. This was much more comprehensive than I had imagined. I think it was a really good discussion. I don't think we have any meetings scheduled for the near term. I mean, we will get into budget season soon enough, but don't worry about marking off your Tuesdays and Thursdays for several weeks anyway.
Well, except
you have an announcement to make, Harry.
Except that I want everyone to know that next Tuesday, January 27 at 5:30, CTO&S is going to be discussing in a public hearing whether advisory committee members should be allowed to serve on other town boards and commissions. So it'll be open for public comment. And if you're on the advisory committee or not on the advisory committee, you may wish to attend this meeting, 5:30, January 27 at CTO&S.
Thank you.
No, I didn't say that. It's the same as the answer.
All right, we're hearing some background noise. Thanks, everybody. Go ahead, Susan.
Just a question. Could we get copies of the slide decks that were shown tonight?
You already have them. They're in the agenda.
Oh, I checked earlier. It must have been put in later.
Susan, just listen to me. They're in the agenda that was reposted at 5 o'clock tonight. So all you need to do is go to it. And
okay.
There.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night and watch your email for. And I really want to thank Kelly and John and Cliff for just putting both an incredible amount of effort outside of this body, but also spending the time to bring us all up to speed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.